Well, thank you for having me here, and thanks for coming on this rainy evening, and especially thanks to the UCD Clinton Institute for providing a forum for conversations like this one and for the broader study of the United States and American foreign policy. I would say the subject of the United States has gotten, say, more interesting here over the past few months as we deal with the challenges, complexities, and uncertainties of a new administration and what it portends. I will not, in the course of my remarks tonight or my answers to your questions, suggest that I am entirely objective as somebody who spent 2 years working hard to get Hillary Clinton elected and to stop Donald Trump from getting into the White House. But I have tried very hard in the months since the election to try to separate my deep and profound concerns about Trump the man and the person occupying the Oval Office from what is actually happening in the United States, what's happening with American foreign policy, what's the direction we are headed. And so this is an effort to be as fair-minded as I possibly can, given my obvious inherent biases on this. What I want to spend my time talking about before we get into a back and forth, and maybe about some of the current events issues like Iran and North Korea, is really the overall direction from my perspective of US foreign policy in an age of Trump, which is also an age of populist discontent with the foreign policy establishment in the United States, what one prominent critic referred to as the Blob. The subtitle of my talk, I think, could be summed up as what the heck is going on with America right now in the world. And I want to start with this simple observation, which is that three basic premises that have formed the foundation for American foreign policy since 1945 are now in doubt. The first is that America's alliances, its NATO alliances, its alliances in the Asia-Pacific, are a strategic asset and not a liability. Donald Trump doesn't believe that. He believes, to a certain extent, the opposite, that they are a liability and not an asset. He's uncomfortable with this mutual security guarantee that we've put forward. He wonders why we'd be rushing to the defense of these other countries, particularly the ones that aren't, in his view, paying their fair share. The second is that values as well as interests matter in the conduct of foreign policy. So when the journalist Bill O'Reilly asked Donald Trump about Vladimir Putin killing journalists in Russia, his response was, look, and this is a quote, "America has killers too, so who are we to judge?" Now, we can have a conversation about how constant America's commitment to values has been, how it's been practiced, and frankly about the veracity of that statement that America has killers too. But this notion that an American president would engage in the very sort of Russian whataboutism that Putin has been spouting for many years is a huge departure from previous American presidents. And the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, reflecting Trump, but also a long career, I think, at a big oil company, has been surprisingly blunt about saying that if values get in the way of our interests, you got to set the values aside. Again, it's not like that's never happened in American foreign policy, but as a fundamental framework, it is a significant shift. The third is probably the most important, and it is the premise that American foreign policy should attempt at least to operate on positive sum logic, that we end up stronger and safer and more prosperous when other countries end up stronger, safer, and more prosperous. Trump essentially sees the world in zero-sum terms. If I could sum up his critique of American foreign policy in 4 words, it would be, they're laughing at us. Other people are taking advantage of us. We're carrying the weight of global leadership and we're not getting our fair share. On the campaign trail, he put it this way, quote, "I want to take everything back from the world that we've given them. We've given them so much." That pretty much sums up the Trump, sort of the essence of the Trump logic. So when you see him tweet about Rocket Man, or talk about the Iran deal, or take steps like pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, underlying all of these acts and all of these theatrics is a core belief system, in my view, that America's global leadership has brought more burdens than benefits, that advancing the common interest is somehow at odds with advancing the American national interest, and that our foreign policy should basically consist of nothing more and nothing less than going out and taking what's ours. Same as every other country in Donald Trump's view. Now, some of what is driving this is a set of currents that should be familiar in the context of the Brexit debate that's unfolding right now in the UK, and obviously has enormous implications for Ireland as well. But some of it, I think, has a uniquely American dimension, and I want to explore that a little bit. So, in the actual practice of rejecting these three premises, what we see is an American approach that's not isolationist in the traditional sense, that's not unilateralist either in the traditional sense, but that's fundamentally transactional, that's all about getting a better deal. So consider this stunning passage from an op-ed that was written by Donald Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, and his top economic advisor, Gary Cohn, in which they attempt to outline what exactly America First is. You've all heard this phrase, America First, as being the flagship phrase of Donald Trump's foreign policy. This is how they put it, and this is an extended quote. The president embarked on his first foreign trip with a clear-eyed outlook that the world is not a global community, but an arena where nations, non-governmental actors, and businesses engage and compete for advantage. We bring to this forum unmatched military, political, economic, cultural, and moral strength. Rather than deny this elemental nature of international affairs, we embrace it. So in place of the liberal international order, which has been the traditional approach of American presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, over the last 50 years, helping build it and then helping defend it, Cohn and McMaster offer the textbook definition of a dog-eat-dog world, a Hobbesian world. In place of enlightened self-interest and a positive-sum mindset, they exalt a zero-sum calculus that says, for us to be up, others have to be down. And embedded in their argument is the quintessentially Trumpian notion, in my view, that sacrificing short-term payoffs to make long-term investments is ultimately a sucker's bet. I'm going to just pause for 1 sec on this notion of the liberal international order, because those of us who studied international relations at Oxford and worked in the Obama administration, this is the kind of thing we defend. I was on the campaign trail last year, and I used this phrase at a public event, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I'm not sure what the liberal international order is, but I don't like any of those three words. And I thought, okay, maybe I need to work on my messaging for what we're trying to do here. So the Cohn-McMaster articulation of the Trump approach has now played out in affirmative actions the United States has taken, like the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, and from the absence of American action, our absence of any sort of affirmative agenda shaping either at the G20 earlier this year in Berlin or at the United Nations General Assembly over the course of the past week, or the complete vacuum that's been left in terms of the United States playing a role in affirmatively mobilizing cooperation or action on some of the big transnational threats we face, whether you're talking about the refugee crisis, dealing with the possibility of another pandemic. And then, of course, there is the constant flirtation and the increasing drumbeat to withdraw from or otherwise imperil the future of the Iran nuclear deal. So that's where we are. But the question really is, how did we get here? And the answer can't just be, well, we elected Donald Trump, so this is what we get. Because from my perspective, in many ways, Trump is the epiphenomenon, and we shouldn't miss the underlying phenomenon that is driving this direction of American foreign policy. The fact is that we're having a debate about America's global role right now in the United States that's actually long overdue. The debate's been coming our way for a while now, maybe even since the end of the Cold War, and Trump has just hastened its arrival. So let's take a step back and consider why. The first reason is because those of us who believe in America's global leadership, we really haven't offered the American people a clear and compelling rationale for our role in the world since the end of the Cold War, which at this point was ended well before an entire generation of Americans, including many Americans who vote in elections, were even born. So of course, during the Cold War, there was a defined enemy. We had a clear mission. And Ronald Reagan sort of summed it up as we win and they lose. Okay, that's simple for people to understand. After the Soviet Union fell, we started looking around for another mission. And for a while after 9/11, we thought we'd found it in this good versus evil struggle with the global war on terror. But it became clear over time to the American people that this had a sort of warping, self-defeating quality to it. And so it couldn't serve as a central organizing principle for American foreign policy. So back we are again to trying to think, why is it we do what we do in the world? Add to this uncertainty the trauma of our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. The American people have basically seen two wars that have cost us much and gained us little, and that's only reinforced their doubts about America taking on substantial international burdens. Meanwhile, in the midst of Iraq and Afghanistan, they endured a financial crisis, and the consequences of that I don't need to describe in detail to this audience who went through its own hard times in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Cost Americans millions of jobs, sapped the savings of tens of millions more. And then there has been this slower moving, less visible crisis, which has been the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs following China's entry into the WTO in 2000. So these crises have only reinforced the public's doubts about globalization and global engagement. Then, of course, there is our politics. Trump and his allies have actually been masterful in blending the economic insecurity of many working class Americans, particularly white Americans, with this fear of the other. And that's created a toxic stew of indistinguishable ingredients: immigration, ISIS, walls, Muslim bans, and so on. And it's contributed to a sense among many of people in our country that we should be taking care of our folks over here and not worrying so much about those folks over there. And this cynical strategy, in turn, has actually raised another more fundamental question about what it even means to be American, what the American creed is. And you can see a sharp divide between Democrats and Republicans on this kind of very basic question of the American national identity. So a recent poll showed 66% of Democrats compared with 35% of Republicans, so 2-to-1, said the mixing of cultures and values from around the world was extremely or very important to American identity. An exactly inverse number, 2/3 of Republicans and 1/3 of Democrats, said a culture grounded in Christian religious beliefs was core to American identity. It just shows you basically you've got two parties with two fundamentally different views on even the most basic question of what it means to be an American. And that has an impact on attitudes about foreign policy. So it's hard to come together around a common vision for our role in the world when we're so divided as a society at home. So I spent the last 2 years on the campaign trail serving as Hillary Clinton's senior policy advisor. And my first reaction to Donald Trump's attacks on American leadership was pretty much to say, it's never going to work. Politically, this is not going to be successful. You can't run down NATO. NATO's popular. You can't suggest that other countries get nuclear weapons and possibly even fight a nuclear war, as he did with Japan and North Korea during the campaign. I thought that's disqualifying. And this whole phrase, America first, that was the slogan of Nazi sympathizers in the United States who wanted to keep us out of the Second World War. So that would never fly, or so I thought. But as I talked to people around the country over the last 2 years, I came to understand why Trump's arguments for a reduced American role, a more competitive American role, appealed to people. Because they were intuitive, they put his audience at the center of the story, and they played to the combination of forces that I've just talked about. But I found something else too, which is the American people haven't risen up en masse to say we shouldn't be engaged in the project of trying to work with other countries to tackle the great challenges of our time. They're open to being convinced to a robust role in the world, to maintaining, if adjusting, our global leadership role. But we've got to convince them. We've got to figure out how to show people in our country that principled nationalism and internationalism are not incompatible. And that the three core premises that I outlined at the beginning of my speech, the role of alliances, the role of values, and the belief that we have to have a fundamentally positive-sum mindset in which our contributions to the liberal international order are contributions that enhance our security and prosperity, but fundamentally attempt to enhance the security and prosperity of others as well. This is going to mean, for us to get this right, going back to basics. We can't just say, well, let's go back to the way things were. Let's just defend what we had and keep it that way. The fact is, we've made mistakes. The world is changing. There are new voices and new powers arising on the international stage. And the shape and scope of power and the shape and scope of the challenges in the world are so much different today than they were 25, 30 years ago. So we need to step up and recognize that it is going to have to look different that American foreign policy and America's leadership role, if we seek to sustain it and carry it forward, will have to be different from how it was before. So this sort of leads me to four things I think that the United States needs to do to shape a more effective, more sustainable foreign policy going forward. First thing we have to do is elevate foreign economic policy within our foreign policy. And in doing so, prioritize in conversations around the Situation Room table, not just conversations among the president's economic advisors, the paramount problem that we confront as a country and that every advanced economy confronts, which is how to sustain an economy where growth works for everyone, where growth works for the middle class and for people trying to get into the middle class in the face of technology, automation, and so many other factors that are hollowing out the kind of economy that we have become used to in the West and in other parts of the world. If I take one thing away from my 2 years on the road with Hillary Clinton, this is it. And this is not just a domestic economic problem. This has to be central to our national security strategy as well. Where are the jobs of the future going to come from? What is the social safety net of the future going to look like? How are we going to make sure that the growth we produce is properly distributed so that everybody can share in it? You might think, okay, that is chiefly about domestic economic policy, and I don't disagree, but the choices we make about our international engagement, the economic policies we're pursuing in terms of trade, in terms of global tax, in terms of global antitrust and competition, and then the more fundamental choices we make, whether we fight wars or not, where we are investing in relationships or not, all of this in a globalized world has an impact. And from my perspective, the United States needs to figure out a way to put the middle class back at the center of international economic decision, center of international foreign policy, national security decision-making, not just in trade, but across the board. This might sound kind of like, well, of course, why isn't it there? And it's a funny thing about the United States, that unlike most of our developed country partners and virtually all developing countries, where this is the thing that every aspect of government is focused on, somehow in the United States, we've ended up dividing between economic policy run down one lane and national security policy run down another lane, and rarely the twain shall meet. And that was my experience. That is the experience I've seen played out over previous administrations as well, and I think we've got to do something about it. The second thing we have to do is a better job of sharing the burden for global problem solving. So historically, for a variety of reasons, the United States has actually borne the lion's share. Let's just think about Asia for a moment. We policed the sea lanes and preserved stability in Asia, and the net result of that was a sufficient degree of certainty and predictability that allowed countries to feel confident to be able to invest and pursue their own economic fortunes and not worry about going to war with one another. The result of that, among others, the remarkable rise of China, which was not somehow the failure of American policy or an oversight of American policy, but rather the direct byproduct of the investments the United States made in the Asia-Pacific region to create the time and space for the Chinese to be able to grow. Whether it's providing resources to respond to threats to international peace and security, whether it's dealing with the Ebola crisis or the Asian tsunami, the United States has, by and large, tended to put the most resources behind the big questions of global problem solving. That is changing dramatically and quickly. Take the current refugee crisis. Yeah, we're putting up some money, but we're not taking refugees the way that we used to, and we're not as instinctively committed to putting the resources forward that by all rights, we should be. But there's another thing happening too, which is that other nations are gaining in strength and resources, and they have more to contribute to the solutions to global problems. So we owe it not just to our people, but to those countries to more effectively be engaged with them in shared solutions to these problems. And so America's leadership role should no longer be focused on the question of how do we absorb the costs of global problem solving, but rather how do we help in the process of allocating those costs effectively to all of the actors who have something to contribute. And in a way, this isn't going to mean less leadership for the United States. In a way, this demands even more leadership because somebody has to play that role of catalyzing and convening and driving results on different issues. And from my time in government, I don't believe the Paris Climate Agreement would have happened if two factors weren't present. The United States wasn't there actually driving the agenda, and other countries, including the European Union, China, Japan, and India, weren't engaged and respected and playing central roles in it as well. And that can be a model going forward, in my view, for how to more effectively deal with these things, rather than the United States just looking at every problem and say, we're going to come in and solve it, and maybe drag a few other folks along with us. Actually think about a more collaborative style to international leadership and problem solving. The third thing that we've got to do is deal more effectively with an answer to the question that has generated so much ambivalence both in our public and around the world about American foreign policy, which is under what circumstances, at what cost, in what ways should the United States be deploying its military power abroad? Now, for a neutral nation like Ireland, you guys, some of you may think the answer is rarely, if ever. I would say it's a little bit more complicated from our perspective, and there's no tidy answer here, but we've learned a couple of things. We've learned, for example, that the United States should be out of the business of fighting significant ground wars in other countries, taking and occupying territory in Iraq and Afghanistan. Whether we can support local partners in certain circumstances with our unique capabilities is another question. But fundamentally, the concept of the United States playing the role of occupying authority is something that we have played out twice now in the past 15 years. Both times, I think, the results have not suggested that this is a good model going forward. The second thing that we've learned is that we've got to figure out a way to rebalance the roles of force and diplomacy in our foreign policy. Not only do we spend a fraction of the resources on our diplomatic efforts that we spend on our military, we tend to think of our diplomatic efforts as being the thing that follows the use of our military, rather than the military being something that can be used as leverage to push forward our diplomatic efforts, is the first thing that we are using and working on. And we've got to get better at that than we have been. If our military tools, when used sparingly in service of an overall diplomatic strategy, are seen in that context and not as a tool of first resort, rather than civilians coming in after military force has been used to try to sort out the aftermath, we'll be better off, and so will the countries in which we are engaged. What is happening instead, I fear, right now in Washington is that the military budget is being plussed up, and the budget for diplomacy and development is on the chopping block, and I think that this is exactly the wrong way to think about our priorities going forward. If it is right, as I have suggested, that American leadership calls for us to engage in a form of leadership that is fundamentally collaborative and catalytic, pulling countries together to solve shared problems, that's fundamentally about diplomacy, and that means that we have got to be investing in diplomacy as our tool of first resort. Finally, I think that we have to put values back at the heart of our foreign policy. Without trying to remake the world in our image, without trying to export the precise elements of the American model around the world as though we placed it in a package and shipped it various places. I believe at the end of the day that the American people see this, feel this as a central part of our overall foreign policy mission. But while Americans can be good and generous people, they're also practical people. They want to know that our efforts are actually going to produce real results. And I think too often they have seen the invocation of values and democracy and good versus evil and black and white at moments when they felt it hasn't actually produced positive results either for us or for the countries in which we're engaged. On the other hand, they're prepared to put huge sums of money behind successful efforts. And what we call PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which George Bush started, Barack Obama expanded, and now is being proposed to be cut, has saved tens of millions of lives, people suffering all over the world from HIV/AIDS. I mean, really an incredible factor in improving the communities and societies of dozens of countries around the world that were afflicted by this terrible epidemic. And it's not just progressives on the left or global do-gooders who supported this. This was supported across the American political spectrum. We should be looking to the other great crises of our time. Take the root causes of the refugee crisis in the Sahel, for example, and apply our efforts there alongside our partners. The United States and Ireland could look to the famines that we see now in East Africa and the potential famines elsewhere in the world and say, let's work together on famine relief, on global hunger, on food security. And in that way, reconnect people to something, to a larger mission than just the pure, naked national self-interest. Now, all of this may sound a bit theoretical, a bit up in the clouds compared with the fact that we could be in a nuclear exchange with North Korea in the next week, or off to the races in a war with Iran very soon, or when Europe is dealing with an immediate refugee crisis stemming from instability and violence across the Middle East and North Africa. But if we do not lay the foundation effectively, if we do not get these premises sorted and learn the lessons of the past 25 years and have a new framework within which to set the larger, difficult challenges or within which to set the more specific challenges that we are trying to deal with today, then we are never going to end up being successful. And so I think I wanted to lay all of this out as a baseline so that we could then have a conversation about some of these larger forces. And I will just close before we get to the difficult choices we have on the big questions of our time with an observation from my years in government at the State Department and at the White House. And it is that, it's something I say frequently, but I feel like we can never say enough, that foreign policy making in general is the sum total of imperfect people armed with imperfect information, facing imperfect choices, managing an imperfect process. And so it's no wonder that we end up getting imperfect results. It was easy for me to criticize people in the Bush administration before I went into government. I am less apt to immediately criticize the decisions on crisis situations like North Korea and the like from the Trump administration, because now I've been there and I've sat in the seat. And I know that the American national pastime is baseball. Baseball stars get into the Hall of Fame if they hit the ball safely 3 out of 10 times. So that means they're getting out 7 out of 10 times. Let's hope that's not quite the record in foreign policy, but it's going to be something close to that. Foreign policy is hard, and any solution to a problem simply begets more problems to solve. It is never fully resolved. It's never fully taken care of. And I think that also has to be a predicate for all of us as we consider this set of issues. So I'm going to leave it at that and just say that from my perspective, I deeply believe that an effective, enlightened foreign policy on the part of the United States that is built on the notion that we can play an active leadership role in working with the rest of the world in mutual respect on the great challenges of our time, that is not just good for our people, it's good for people everywhere. It is achievable. It is something that we can do if we set our sights correctly and we steer our course correctly. And I don't see, and in this sense, I'm a short-term pessimist because I see the current administration setting their sights differently and steering a course differently. But I'm a long-term optimist because I believe fundamentally in the capacities of the United States as a military, economic, and democratic power. And I believe fundamentally in the qualities of the American people to come back to the core premises that I talked about at the start of my lecture. So let me leave it there for now, say thank you again to UCD and the Clinton Institute, and invite all of you to ask any questions that are on your mind, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you.